I like it when a monitor is good and affordable at the same time. And the MSI G273QF is exactly that. A really good 1440p monitor that doesn't break the bank. It doesn't have any crazy headline features, no flashy design with tons of RGB or anything like that. It rather delivers on what really counts. Fast response times, good picture quality, and after all, a reasonable price. Now, the G273QF is a classic 27-inch QHD gaming monitor. We get an IPS panel with a refresh rate of 165Hz and the necessary ports. But that's pretty much it. No speakers and no height adjustable stand. Well, if you're planning to mount your monitor anyway and generally are using headphones, you probably couldn't care less. I have to say, I find it a bit annoying though when monitors don't have any speakers built in, but even some more expensive monitors come without speakers, so yeah. Now, the stand, even though it doesn't offer much adjustability, looks and feels pretty premium. The base actually is made from metal, while the pillar is plastic. Now, the legs extend relatively wide to either side, even forwards past the display. I generally could get the monitor close enough, despite I'm using a large deskpad and I didn't smash my mouse into the leg once. But if that's something that concerns you, you probably should mount the MSI on a monitor arm. That's also necessary if you want to adjust the height of the display. It's fixed at 11 cm desk to screen with the default stand. The only parameter that's adjustable is tilt. Here the adjustment range is decent though. Now, the G273QF really isn't a monitor you're gonna get for its ergonomics. Or if you want a spectacular design. The real selling point is that 27-inch IPS panel. The factory menu tells us that this panel is from AUO. According to PC monitors, this actually is the same panel as the popular MSI 274QF series is using as well. Albeit the QD version of that monitor, as the name suggests, uses a quantum dot backlight instead of the regular white LED backlight that the cheaper G273QF is using. That means we should expect differences when it comes to color related stuff, but it's reasonable to expect a very similar response times performance. And as we'll see in a bit, the G273QF doesn't disappoint in that aspect. Now, depending on your point of view, what might be a bit disappointing though is the contrast ratio the G273QF is able to achieve. I measured a mediocre 882:1, which is still a bit better than what many of LG's nano IPS panels usually do. But generally, everything below the magical 1000:1 barrier is a bit disappointing. Though I have to admit that the visual difference between this and, let's say, something like the ASUS XG27AQ, which measures slightly over 1100:1, really isn't that huge. And as I probably said 100 times by now, a somewhat low contrast ratio really isn't a problem when it comes to fast-paced games like first-person shooters. Now, the lower contrast is somewhat visible though when it comes to content creation and content consumption. In dark scenes, the experience definitely isn't that great. Of course, something like a super bright anime looks great, and I wouldn't be able to tell that the contrast isn't the best if it wasn't for those black bars on either side. As the unit that I got hasn't the best backlight uniformity, brighter spots are somewhat visible in those black bars. Here is a photo of the backlight under realistic conditions, and the exaggerated exposure shows nicely that I was a bit unlucky in the panel lottery this time. Here is the ASUS XG27AQ for some context. Now, backlight bleed and IPS glow are substantially more noticeable when having set the monitor to a brightness that is too high for the current ambient light. Luckily, the G273QF can be set to just 60 nits in its lowest setting. On the other end of the spectrum, we get 335 nits, which is pretty much standard for a monitor like this, but decently bright nevertheless. Pretty much the same is true when it comes to colors and saturation. This monitor renders pretty vivid and saturated colors nicely, but that's kinda expected from a good 1440p IPS panel these days. It's not really capable of the highly saturated green to cyan tones though that would be necessary for a good Adobe RGB coverage. The DCI-P3 coverage doesn't look too bad though. And of course, sRGB is covered with an overall color gamut volume of about 1.3 times as large as the sRGB color space. Larger than sRGB of course means colors will look oversaturated in most cases. For somewhat competitive gaming though, this is pretty beneficial. For my liking, colors could even be a bit more saturated or vibrant for games like COD Vanguard. To increase the vibrance, we have to fall back to tools like NVIDIA filters, as the G273QF doesn't provide a vibrance option in the OSD. If you're in a pinch, you could switch to the racing mode, as this has a vibrance boost built in. Don't forget switching back to the user setting though when you're done gaming, because the racing mode is pretty far from color accurate. Now let's take a look at the color accuracy that we get from the G273QF out of the box in its default settings. Overall, this doesn't look too bad, both in terms of numbers and to the eye. With some simple tweaks we can improve the white point further, which overall gives us a pretty good result. Now of course the delta E won't be great, mainly because of the oversaturation we just discussed a minute ago. The delta H tells us how accurate the color hues are, ignoring color saturation. And I made the numbers orange here as it just barely missed the target, so I'd still consider that a decent result. Performing a full calibration and profiling on top of that of course gives us the best accuracy. Though even when measuring against sRGB, the maximum delta E is a bit higher than we would like for professional color work. Though I wouldn't hesitate to use the MSI for hobby photo editing or even semi-professional stuff. At least as long as you're sticking to sRGB, as the DCI-P3 coverage is a bit too low, leading to somewhat higher delta E's here. Now, if an individual calibration isn't an option for you, these are the settings I recommend using. And as always, you can download my ICC profile from the video description, and I suggest using it in conjunction with these settings. Also, you will notice that the brightness takes a big hit when changing the color temperature from the default normal mode to the user customizable setting. MSI for some reason decided to choose 50 for the sliders as the default value, whereas it really should be 100 in this case. I suspect they just copied the firmware over from some other model and try to get away with as few changes as possible. So that's something to keep in mind when changing the color temperature. But at least MSI chose to enable adaptive sync by default. And as the G273QF was officially certified by NVIDIA as G-Sync compatible, we don't even have to manually enable G-Sync in the NVIDIA control panel. So G-Sync is really plug and play here and works without a flaw. In my testing with a 2070 Super, I didn't encounter a single issue like flickering or anything like that. We kinda expect that from a G-Sync certified monitor, but it's nice to see nevertheless. The low framerate compensation also works nicely and, according to my testing, jumps in at around 55 FPS. Alright, but what about the response times related stuff? Well, to give you my brief subjective impression, it's a very fast monitor and it can keep up with the fastest of its class, no problem. For a more in-depth look, we're of course gonna use Blurbuster's pursued camera technique. Now, the OSD offers 3 different overdrive modes, which obviously isn't much. The first mode that MSI call normal shows some smearing, while the strongest overdrive setting already causes some inverse ghosting at the trailing edge of the UFO. So the remaining fast mode is the sweet spot and hence what we'll be using at 165 Hz. Of course, we'll pull up some other monitors for comparison in a bit, but first let's check whether the fast mode works for the other refresh rates as well. At 144 Hz, that's certainly the case. And I would even say that the fast setting is even ever so slightly more optimized for 144 Hz than for 165. Anyhow, the fast mode is perfect for adaptive sync gaming close to the maximum refresh rate. Console gamers that use 120 Hz exclusively should also be using the fast mode, though at 60 Hz, fast starts to show some inverse ghosting. It's not that extreme, but you should definitely switch to the normal mode if you're often gaming at 60 Hz or close. Now, I promised to show some other monitors for comparison, so here we go. The Dell S2721DGF uses LG's Nano IPS panel and runs at the exact same refresh rate as the MSI. Both look great, but the MSI shows ever so slightly less smearing, which of course is an advantage. A very small one though. The Asus XG27AQ that I just recently reviewed runs at 170 Hz, but that's certainly close enough to 165 to make no considerable difference. If we're really pixel peeping, the overdrive setting of the Asus probably is slightly more optimized, showing a tiny amount less smearing. But I honestly doubt that anyone would be able to spot such a minuscule difference like this in-game. I certainly can't. Now the AW2721D in comparison looks clearer than the others at first glance, but that's because it runs at 240 Hz. When we compare all at a refresh rate of 144 Hz, any differences are pretty much gone. The performance is so close that I would call them evenly matched, which is a great achievement for the MSI. Those other monitors generally are among the fastest 1440p IPS on the market, and the MSI is the most affordable monitor of the bunch. Now, MSI have also implemented a backlight strobing mode, which they call MPRT, and to my astonishment, I have to say it's not terrible. To start with the good news first, this mode very successfully reduces motion blur, which of course is what a backlight strobing mode is all about. Now, the trailing ghost image is very faint, so that's nice as well. Though I wish MSI would let us tune the overdrive further, but activating MPRT unfortunately locks us out of the overdrive control. The same is true for the brightness control, which is a bit annoying. So the brightness is fixed to roughly 140 nits, which honestly is a pretty good value if your room is not too bright or pitch black. But keeping the brightness adjustable would of course have been much better. Also, some of you might have already noticed the faint red fringes around the UFO, which are caused by the slow decay of red phosphor that's very likely been used in this panel. But I've seen much worse than that, and it's really not that noticeable in game. Crosstalk isn't too bad either, though there's no option to adjust the strobe phase in the OSD menu. Anyways, this certainly is not a monitor you should buy because of its backlight strobing abilities. First and foremost, it delivers top-notch response times performance without strobing. That the strobing mode is actually usable is just the cherry on top. Now, so far the review has been fairly positive, and there really isn't much to hate about the G273QF. One of the most apparent drawbacks in comparison to more expensive offerings of the same category clearly is the lack of a height adjustable stand. Of course, this is a non-issue for anyone who's planning to mount the monitor anyway. Apart from the ergonomics, the contrast ratio isn't the best either. It's below the 1000:1 mark, which is somewhat on the lower side. But that's also true for most monitors that use LG's Nano IPS panel instead, which is fairly popular in the 27-inch 1440p category due to how fast it is. And in terms of response times performance, the G273QF's panel from AUO Panel can keep up without a problem. And MSI have really done a good job of tuning the overdrive. So after all, this is one of the fastest monitors of its class. And MSI even have implemented a backlight strobing mode that isn't terrible, which honestly speaking is something we rarely ever see. So the overall value we're getting here from a $300-ish monitor probably is the biggest selling point. Of course, I will have it linked down below for you to check it out, or if you rather want to spend a bit more, I recommend checking out my review of the Alienware AW2721D, which costs roughly twice as much, but definitely is a considerable upgrade. Or you could just buy two of the MSI, which also doesn't sound like a bad idea. Also, huge thanks to my Patreons und wir sehen uns im nächsten Video.